Hello, everybody, and it's good to be back with you. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas and a happy New Year. And I'm excited to get back into Philippians. So, where I'll be at today is I'll be looking at Philippians 2 19 through 24. I'm not going to go very far, and we're not going to deal with a lot of text today, just these five verses. There's a lot being said here, obviously, but I just want to focus in on those verses today and talk about Timothy and what that means. Now, before I start, I got to remind you about something that I mentioned at the very beginning. In fact, I discussed it to a great deal. That what governs the body of this letter, and what I mean by that is, what is Paul's communicative purpose in the body of the letter? Now remember, the body of the letter is where all the good stuff is at, all the good material. You have your exhortations and your purposes, why you're doing things, and reasons. I mean, this is where the meat of the information or the letter is at within the body itself. In chapter 1, verse 27, there is an important word that is used, and it's the word that we translate as conduct or behavior sometimes. I think it could be, sometimes might be translated as behavior. Now, this word shows up again in a different form, what we call a cognate, because in Greek you can change words from verbs to nouns very, very easily. And so you could have the root of the similar word as a verb also being expressed as a noun. Well, the cognate of the word for conduct in 127 shows up again in chapter 3, verse 20. Now, this word that we translate as conduct in 127, this governs all of this body of the letter. And it's an interesting word. It's interesting in that it's not used hardly at all in the New Testament. I think it only shows up 2 times in the entire New Testament. And it's not even used in the Greek version of the Old Testament very much. It seems to be a word that is associated with secular order to some degree. It's a word that the Romans like to use concerning their law and order philosophy of governing. Let's put it that way. The word is closely associated also with the word for city or community. And the idea is that this is conduct or behavior associated with a community that has certain shared values. Now, in the Roman government, it was about conduct that would be cooperative with their law and order mindset, the way that they wanted to run their kingdom. Law and order, again, was very important to the Roman people. But this word in 127 is not a typical word for behavior in the New Testament. In fact, as I said, this word in itself in Philippians is not used very much. There are other words for behavior. I can think of one off the top of my head real quickly that is much more commonly used, let's say that. But this word in 127 is also used, I think Paul uses it, and most scholars would agree with this, is that it's a word that's very important to Roman ideals. And in Philippi, we have a large Roman settlement. Remember, this is a settlement for retired military personnel. So again, 127, we're talking about conduct. How are you going to behave within your community? Then we start having examples. So I'm going to come back to these as we go through this, but the first example was Jesus, and you have that from chapter 2, verse 5 through 11. You have an example of Jesus. And the example of Jesus is not about obedience, even though obedience does show up. But the example about Jesus is how he humbled himself. In fact, in chapter 2, verse 5, it says something to the effect of, let me look it up real quick so I get it. Have this way of thinking among yourselves. I think that's exactly the way the Greek. Think this way among yourselves. And so he's getting ready to lay out how they should think about the way they're supposed to behave with one another, the way they're supposed to behave in Christian service, because Christian service is going to be very important in these examples that are coming up. But again, you cannot emulate what Jesus has done as far as like providing the achievement of salvation. It's just not possible. And Jesus is a unique individual. He lived perfectly. He never committed a sin, even though there had to be the potential there for him to violate the covenant. The promise of the blessing doesn't make any sense from Deuteronomy 28 as Paul explains it in Galatians, unless there was a reason that Jesus may have failed. We also see this argumentation in Hebrews chapter 4, where it talks about Jesus encountered everything that we encountered, all the weaknesses of humanity. Yet, the writer says, he did not sin. So he makes that point that he experienced everything we have, and he did not sin. I talked about the temptation scenes in the Gospel of Matthew last Sunday, and they're also presented in Luke. But in these temptation scenes, Jesus really struggled. I mean, the narrator wants us to know that he fasted for 40 days. You would be really hungry after 40 days. That's a long time. He wants us also to know at the very end of the episode that the angels had to come and serve him because he was such in a weak and depleted state, physically and mentally and spiritually, after this encounter with Satan and his experience in the wilderness. So the point being is that Jesus was able to be perfectly obedient. We are not going to be able to. We're just too affected by sin. Now, to differentiate between Jesus and ourselves, I think is probably an argument that we don't really need to discuss too much. Just to realize that there has to be a difference, and that Jesus had to experience all of this stuff, and there was the potential there for him to fail. But in Philippians 2, 5 through 11, the point about this is about humbling yourself and thinking about other people's interests. That's what Jesus was thinking about. He was thinking about our interests and the Father's interest as he achieved the salvation plan. And so we're supposed to have this kind of mindset, a mindset of thinking about others, humbling ourselves, and serving God's will, in a sense. After that, you have Timothy, and I'm going to talk about Timothy today. Epaphroditus comes next. I'll talk about him next week. And then we have the Judaizers, which are a bad example. The group of the Judaizers is a bad example of people who are not behaving according to conduct associated with Christian community. Remember, that's what we're talking about, conduct associated with Christian community. And then you have Paul himself, and Paul's really interesting how he talks about himself. Now, I'm not going to talk about those others. I've already talked about the example of Jesus a couple weeks ago or a few weeks ago. I want to talk about Timothy today. And so we're looking at verses 19 through 24. If you want to take a moment to read that section, I encourage you to do so. Just pause the video and then come back to it. All right, so Timothy. Who is this person, Timothy? He's a pretty prominent character in Paul's ministry. However, he doesn't show up until Paul's second missionary journey. So basically, Paul has 3 missionary journeys that we know of for sure from the book of Acts. The third one's not really a missionary journey. It's basically his trip to Rome. He stops off at Malta, and there's some things going on there. And he does have a great gospel ministry, a great outreach there where he converts some people in Malta. But it wasn't really a planned missionary journey. But you have the first missionary journey, and that's Paul and Barnabas. And they're very active, and they're very successful. They do a lot of ministry in Asia Minor, Western Asia Minor, or modern-day Turkey. It would be Western modern-day Turkey, but in that area. And then they come back, and there's a council meeting in Acts chapter 15, and then Paul and Barnabas have a dispute about the role of John Mark in their ministry. And they seem to separate ways, and we really don't know what happens to Barnabas after that. He just goes on and does his own thing. Historically, some people postulate that he could have been very instrumental in a ministry in Crete. That's possible. Who knows? But we do know more about what Paul is doing. And so Paul, after this split with Barnabas, he begins another missionary journey with a person by the name of Silas. Now, here's what's so interesting. So Silas starts it's Acts 16, basically, or into 15, into 16. But anyway, in Acts 16, we have this person, Timothy, mentioned. This is the first time he's mentioned in the writing of Acts. Timothy was from a town called Lystra, and his mother was Jewish. We don't know anything about his father, but we can assume that his father was not Jewish. Timothy is called a disciple, and he becomes very, very involved with Paul. In fact, we have several letters where Timothy's name is mentioned in the in the greeting section, meaning that he's part of the production of the letter. So, for instance, in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, Timothy is mentioned as part of the letter producing team, he along with Paul and Silas. Timothy is mentioned in Philippians. Timothy is mentioned as part of the writing team in Colossians. And then, of course, we have 1 Timothy, where Timothy's doing some things in Ephesus. And we also have mention of Timothy in Hebrews. And in the writing of Hebrews, chapter 13, it tells us that Timothy has been in prison. Now, this would be after Paul's death, the writing of Hebrews. But Timothy has been in prison. So that tells us a little bit about this person, Timothy. So he's very instrumental in Paul's ministry. And Paul even has very endearing language, warm and loving language to describe his relationship with Timothy. He calls himself a father to Timothy, that kind of idea. So they had a very, very close relationship, it seems. So what we find out about Timothy, there's a couple things we find out about Timothy in this section. First is this. In verse 20, if you notice, well, we start in verse 19. Paul hopes to be able to send Timothy very soon. So what could be holding him up? Well, Timothy may not be with him and where he's imprisoned at in Rome. That very well could be, or something else is going on, but Paul's hope is to send Timothy as quickly as possible to check on them. There seems to be a small problem that is arising in the church in Philippi. We're going to see more of this when we get into chapter 4, but there's not ever a lot of details given to us about that. But Paul wants to send Timothy to check on them and also to thank them for their financial help and for their prayer support and so many other things. So he's sending Timothy back. He says a couple things about Timothy, though. So in verse 20, he says that this is a person who is sincerely concerned. That's what it says. He is a sincerely concerned person. In fact, Paul says he has no one else that's like this. Now, he's exaggerating a little bit because Epaphroditus obviously is a very honorable and exceptional person also, we'll find out next week. And there are others too. Silas, I don't know why he doesn't mention Silas in here, but he doesn't. But Silas is also a person who is an honorable helper in Paul's ministry. But he picks out Timothy here, and he says that he is has a genuine concern for other people. Now remember, this is all about being concerned about other people's interests, just like the example Jesus gave us in 5 through 11. And so he brings us out about Timothy, that he has a sincere concern. He's not false. He's not phony. He has a genuine care for other people. Now, it is true, Timothy is where he came from is not far from this place, Philippi. There's no doubt about it. We can see that on the journey as far as where Paul's going, that is right after this, that he comes to Philippi. But Timothy is going to go back and check on some things there. And he has this great character attribute about him, and that he is concerned about other people, and he puts their interests ahead of his own. And that sounds a lot like Christian leadership to me. In fact, most of the time in Christian leadership, we get it wrong because we think top down. That's not the way Christian leaders function. In fact, if anybody's interested in Christian leadership and what it's supposed to be, you need to read John chapter 13. This is the best instruction about Christian leadership there is in the entire New Testament, because this is about the part where Jesus washes the disciples' feet. Christian leadership goes from the bottom up. We serve others is what we do. And that's what Timothy does. He doesn't have any concern about power or being popular or being the loudest or anything like that. He has concerns for other people and not himself. He is not a selfish person. Now in verse 22, we find out some more information. He serves in the ministry of the gospel. So we're going to find out all kinds of things about people serving, but it's very interesting he brings this up about Timothy. He serves in the ministry of the gospel. Nothing else. It's quite interesting what he says there. So Timothy actively works to share the message of salvation. That's what we're talking about, gospel. We have got to be very concrete in the way that we define our terms. The gospel is a word for good news. In a Christian context, it's about the good news of salvation. So, excuse me. So Timothy is being evangelistic in the truest sense. He is sharing the message. He is going out and making disciples, as Jesus has said about that. And so he's sincere, not like other teachers, like Jesus describes in Matthew chapter 7. In fact, in 18 and 22, Matthew 7, 18 through 22, Jesus goes through this discussion about false teachers, and he talks about fruit from a tree, and he says basically a corrupt tree cannot produce good fruit, and a good tree cannot produce corrupt fruit, that kind of idea. And then he talks about false teachers, and he says you'll know them by their character, is what he says, by what they produce. And so, but Timothy is not like this. He is sincere. So what he produces is a sincere reflection of his relationship with the Lord, his Christian conviction, and what he is supposed to be doing. Now, we're all supposed to be evangelistic. In fact, this would be a good label or description for all of us to receive. So-and-so was very active in the gospel ministry. That would be a great description given to a person. That would be a huge compliment for a Christian. This is where our focus is to be. We are to be working as Timothy works, to share the message of salvation to to non-Christians. Now, he's praised for nothing else. So it doesn't talk about his ability to memorize Scripture or to know Scripture or anything of that effect. It praises him for being actively involved in the sharing of the message of salvation. The gospel ministry is the job of the church. It is the job. No one else is going to do it. It is our job to go out and to share this good news of salvation in Jesus Christ. And the church is also to disciple Christians, and so that they mature in their faith. Now, it doesn't talk about that with Timothy, even though he is involved in that, especially like in the writings of Hebrews, I'm thinking of, because the writer of Hebrews says that he and Timothy are going to come and help out this congregation. Seems to be in Rome maybe, but in this congregation in terms of spiritual maturity, growing, so forth and so on. So Timothy does have that kind of role in other places, but in Philippians, Paul praises him for simply being evangelistic. It is the church's role to share the message of salvation. No one else is going to do it. No one else can connect people with God except the church. And so we've got to really become more church-centered in the way we think about certain things. So Timothy, his concern is, he has a concern for God's interests, obviously, and he also has a concern for people's interests. So God's will is for his kingdom to expand, and for the constituents within that kingdom to grow spiritually. That is what he wants to do. He wants to expand his kingdom and improve the people that are within it. And Timothy is a part of the first part of this, as far as expanding this Christian community. So that is what he is known for. So great attributes. Now real quick, I'll just sum this up, and I'm coming to close this out in a second. We have many examples. We have 4 good examples in Philippians, and we have 1 bad example. But 127 through 320, we have this section where all these examples are being presented. And in this, we have examples that are worthy of our intention and emulation. And we have an example that it's a warning not to be like this. Timothy's a good example. We should be like this. We should have others' interests ahead of our own interests, as Timothy does. So again, he had God's will, obviously first and foremost in his mind, and that he's actively involved in the gospel ministry. And then Paul also says that he has the concern for other people. He's concerned about other people's interests. And so this is the kind of example that we need from Timothy. Now, one more thing real quick about the character part I had in, it's in verse 22. I'm sorry, I think I even skipped that, verse 22. But it talks about him having proven character. That word, I think our translations don't have character there. In fact, let me look real quick. I'm looking at the ESV and I'm looking at verse 22 of chapter 2. Please excuse me, I'm sorry. Should have had this in my notes. And in the ESV, it says proven worth, the word that's used there. But this word is the word for character. It's the same word that's used in Romans 5:4, where it talks about suffering produces perseverance, perseverance produces character, and character produces hope. I might have missed one in there, but we have this progression here of things going on, and it's the same word that's used there about character, a proven character. So again, Timothy is sincere, and it's obvious from others. They've seen it. It's not like he's acting this way. It is within him. He is a sincere minister of the gospel message. There's no doubt about it, just as Paul was too. And so Timothy's a great example for us as far as being unselfish, evangelistic, and serving God's interests. Now again, we'll pick up some more as we go on next week. In fact, next week I'll look at the example of Epaphroditus, and this is all I want to look at today is Timothy. So I hope you've enjoyed this. And again, just think about Timothy and the way that he acted and behaved within the Christian community and within the call that he had as far as fitting in, using his talents and his abilities to expand God's kingdom and improve constituents within it also. Well, thank you very much, and I look forward to our time next week, and I hope you have just a wonderful rest of your week, and I'll plan on seeing you on Sunday. Bye.